My name is Emily Carter. I have 62 years old, and I'm from Boise, Idaho. All my life, I believed in the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was raised to obey, to trust, to believe that the more faithful I was, the more protection God would give my family. I lived this way for decades, in peace, convinced that I was on the right path, until the day my son left on a sacred mission and never returned. Nothing in the world prepares a mother for silence, for vague answers, for the cold gaze of leaders, for the weight of a faith that suddenly stops comforting and begins to wound. Today, after years of keeping everything bottled up inside, I decided to speak out, not to attack, but to free myself and all who still believe that obedience is the same as trusting in God. Comment your city and country, so I know where my story is going. Leave a like if you believe faith should never be used to hide the truth, and subscribe to hear more real stories. From the moment my son was born, everyone at church said he was a different, blessed child. I like to think it was true. He grew up within the walls of the temple, listening to hymns, memorizing scriptures, and attending meetings with a sparkle in his eyes that few others had. I never had to force him to pray. He was the one who reminded me to bend my knees before bed. "Mom," he would say in that sweet, confident voice, "one day I will wear the nameplate of Jesus Christ. I will bring the truth to the world." And I believed it. We all believed it. My husband was a deacon and served as a ward counselor. Our home was known for its order and spiritual discipline. On Sundays, everything revolved around church: the crisp clothes, the hymnal open on the table, the sound of our little family singing, "Called to Serve." It felt like we were being watched from heaven. I looked at my son and thought that God had truly chosen him for something greater. When he turned 18, the most anticipated moment arrived: his missionary assignment. It was a cold November night, and the whole family gathered in the living room. The letter was in his hands, and the air seemed suspended. When he read the destination, Mission Santiago Norte, Chile, everyone cried. It was one of those moments when time seems to stand still, and faith becomes almost palpable. I hugged him and said, "Son, this is the beginning of your eternity." He replied with a smile, "Mom, I'm going to make God proud." The following days were a mixture of tears and preparation. The community helped, and the brothers in the ward donated suits, shoes, books, and even tickets. The bishop visited us frequently, always emphasizing what an honor the calling was. "Few young people have this purity," he would say. "Your son was chosen because he has a special spirit." I was filled with pride and secretly also with fear. I knew the mission would be tough, but I trusted that the Lord would take care of him. The farewell ceremony took place at the Missionary Training Center in Provo. It was a beautiful ceremony, with hundreds of young people dressed in white, all ready to leave. They sang together, prayed together, and in that moment, I felt like heaven was opening up above us. He gave me one last hug before getting on the bus. "Mom, don't cry. I'll be back in 2 years, and when I do, I'll be a better man." I watched him leave with a full heart and trembling hands, believing I was handing my son over to God himself. The first letters arrived a few weeks later. He spoke about his missionary work, the families he taught, and the warmth of the Chilean people. He said he was tired but happy. "Mom, I already know what it's like to love people I don't even know, and it's wonderful." Each word he spoke was confirmation that it was all worth it. I read and reread the letters until I memorized them, as if God's voice were telling me, "You did the right thing." The leaders' visits continued, and everyone said my faith was an example. To other women in the ward, "You have the heart of a heavenly mother," they once told me. I smiled, trying to appear strong, but inside I felt his absence eating away at the silence of the house, the empty room, the extra plate on the table, the echo of prayers said alone. Still, I endured. It's the price of serving the Lord, I thought. Time passed, and with it came a kind of spiritual tranquility. The letters became shorter, perhaps due to the intense routine of the mission, but the love remained the same. He would say, "The work is hard, but the spirit is strong." I imagined him walking the dusty streets, Bible in hand, and the name of Christ on his chest. That filled me with pride and an almost naive faith. On a testimony Sunday, the bishop asked me to speak to the congregation about my son. I stepped to the pulpit and with a trembling voice told them about the dedicated young man, about the example he was. I told them that the mission had transformed him and that I felt his presence in my prayers. Everyone wept. In that moment, I felt that my family represented the purest aspects of the Mormon faith: obedience, sacrifice, and hope. The stake president greeted me after the service and said, "Sister Carter, your son is an inspiration to many young people. The Lord has chosen him for something great." I didn't know those words would take on a new meaning months later, one that would cut to my heart. As the months passed, something in me changed. I prayed more, fervently, but sometimes I felt a tightness in my chest, a restlessness I couldn't explain. His letters began to arrive less frequently. At first I thought it was normal. Then I began counting the days. Each week without news felt like an eternity. But back then, I still believed that everything was part of God's plan, that God was in control, that nothing bad could happen to a young man who had dedicated his life to the gospel. I didn't know, no one knew, that that calling, which once brought me so much pride, would be the beginning of my greatest pain. Symbolic phrase. Ever since he was little, he said he wanted to wear the badge and preach the gospel. I saw him as a chosen one. The day of departure arrived with the weight and beauty of a dream come true. The bus station was filled with families, missionaries, and tears. I remember the smell of rain in the air and my son's hands trembling as he held his passport and copy of the Book of Mormon. His suit was a little loose, the sleeves rolled up neatly, and his name, Elder Carter, shone across his chest like a promise. I hugged him tightly, trying to capture that moment forever, the sound of his voice saying, "I love you, Mom," and the naive certainty that God would protect him. As the bus pulled away, I felt as if a part of my heart had gone with it. The first few weeks were filled with emotion and faith. He wrote to me from the missionary training center, describing the intense studies, the hymns sung at dawn, the enthusiasm of the other young people. "Mom, it's like being in heaven. I've never felt the Spirit so strongly," he would say. I read the letters with teary eyes, imagining my son enveloped in light, surrounded by angels. At night, I prayed, thanking God for giving me such a faithful son. Then came the first letters from the mission field. The tone changed a bit. Now there was less euphoria, more realism. He spoke of long walks in the sun, of people who wouldn't listen, of the loneliness of the days. Still, he maintained his optimism. "The Lord gives me strength when I think of giving up," he once wrote. I was proud of his maturity and dedication. But as the months passed, I began to notice something different between the lines. The letters became shorter, less enthusiastic. The spark that once shone in every word seemed to have faded. He still wrote, "I love this work," but it was a tired, forced, almost rehearsed love. In one letter, he mentioned a new mission leader. "The president just arrived. He's a firm, demanding man. He demands total obedience. Sometimes it's difficult, but he says it's for our spiritual growth." I tried not to worry, but something about that sentence bothered me. A short time later, another letter arrived. It was different from the others, more confused, more hesitant. "Mom, sometimes I feel the Spirit is silent. I try to pray, but I feel nothing. Maybe I'm being tested." I read those words and felt a chill. My son, the one who prayed even when he didn't need to, now no longer felt God's presence? I wrote back immediately, telling him to trust, that every servant goes through moments of desertion, and that the Lord always speaks at the right time. I believed this. I needed to believe. For a few weeks, his answers returned to a calm tone, almost as if he wanted to shield me from worry. "It's okay, Mom. God knows what he's doing," he'd say. But there was something about that sentence, something cold, rehearsed, as if he were repeating it more to himself than to me. In another letter, he mentioned that the president had transferred his mission companion suddenly, without explanation. "He said it was for my spiritual growth too," he wrote. It was the first time I felt fear. I began to notice small but disturbing details: the shaky handwriting, the spacing between sentences, the tense tone that tried to appear calm. It was as if he were trying to tell me something without being able to write openly. Once, I noticed that a letter appeared to have been opened and repasted. When I asked him about it, his answer was simply, "Letters are reviewed, Mom. It's part of the process. Nothing to worry about." but I worried. A lot. The following weeks were the longest of my life. Every Monday, mail day, I waited by the window. The sound of the mailman approaching was a mixture of hope and terror. I read every line, searching for clues, trying to understand what was really happening. In one of his last letters before he disappeared, he wrote, "Something that kept me awake at night. The mission president said we must sacrifice everything for the Lord, even what we love, if necessary." That sentence pierced me like a blade. What did that mean? Sacrifice what? Why? I wrote back asking for an explanation, but there was no response. It was the last letter I received from him in a normal tone. From then on, only brief communications came. Cold, impersonal notes, some typed. "I'm fine. Working hard. The Lord is good." No detail, no emotion. They seemed like messages from someone else. I read and reread them, trying to recognize my son's voice within, but everything sounded distant, mechanical, empty. One night I dreamed of him. He was in an open field, surrounded by fog. He called to me, but I couldn't get close. When I woke, I knew, with the instinct only a mother possesses, that something terrible had happened. I went to the bishop and asked him to help me contact the mission president. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and discomfort. "Sister Carter," he said, "sometimes we have to trust that the Lord is in control, even when we don't understand." I returned home with my heart in pieces. I wanted to believe he was right, that it was just a rough patch, but something inside me screamed, it wasn't. Something was wrong, very wrong. The prayers that once brought me peace now left me restless. The words seemed to stay with me forever. I tried to think positively, remembering the prophet's promises of protection and blessings to faithful missionaries. But the silence of the letters was louder than any prophecy. It was then that I decided to write one last letter, unlike any other. "Son, no matter what's happening, I love you. It doesn't matter what anyone said or what anyone asked you to do. I just want you to know that you can tell me anything." I sent it with my heart racing, feeling like it might be my last chance to reach him. I waited. A week, 2, 3. No answer. No phone calls. No visits from the CE leaders. Not a word of comfort. Only silence. And it was in that silence that I began to understand. Perhaps the Spirit hadn't been silent. Perhaps he was trying to show me the truth. Symbolic phrase. Something about his words seemed different, as if the Spirit had gone silent. The day the last letter arrived was like any other. The mailman passed by, dropped the white envelope in the box, and I ran with my heart racing, as I did every Monday. The paper bore the same Chilean stamp, but something about the handwriting seemed different. The lines were stiffer, less delicate, almost impersonal. I read the letter with trembling hands. It was short, direct, and unemotional. "I'm fine, Mom. Working hard. I have little time to write. God is good." No details. No "I love yous." No mention of his partner, the families he visited, the weather, or the food. It was as if my son had disappeared, and someone had taken control of his voice. After that, the silence began. A week passed, then 2, and still nothing. I tried not to panic. "Maybe they're in a mailless area," the bishop said, trying to calm me. "Or the mission president must have changed the mailing schedule." But time continued to pass, and excuses no longer suffocated the anguish that gnawed at me. I started writing, even though there was no response, like someone throwing bottles into the sea. "Son, Mommy loves you. Please tell me how you are." No response. I called the mission office in Santiago, but the secretary just said, "Elder Carter is in a remote area, sister. Everything is under control." I asked where exactly, and she replied, "Unfortunately, we can't give details for security reasons." Weeks turned into months. Each day without news was an open wound. I would wake in the middle of the night thinking I heard the phone ring, the voicemail ring, his voice. Sometimes I dreamed of my son's face, smeared with dust, looking at me with eyes full of fear. I would wake screaming his name. I would pray on my knees, begging God to give me a sign, a word, anything. But the heavens seemed closed, impenetrable. People in the church began to drift away. At first, everyone would ask kindly, "Any news from Elder Carter?" Then the conversation fell silent. When I mentioned my son's name, they would change the subject. They seemed uncomfortable, as if my pain were an inconvenient reminder of something they'd rather not see. The bishop, who had previously visited our home weekly, began to avoid contact. Once, I ran into him in the chapel parking lot, and he said to me, his eyes downcast, "Sister, it's best to trust the Lord. Sometimes knowing too much gets in the way of His plan." Those words tore me apart. How could I disrupt God's plan by wanting to know where my son was? What kind of faith requires ignoring pain? That night, I cried until I had no tears left. "Lord," I whispered, "please show me where he is." But only silence answered. My husband, more restrained, tried to reassure me. Maybe he was transferred. Maybe he's in a place with no mail. But even he began to doubt. One day I saw him sitting at the table, holding the Book of Mormon closed, his gaze lost. "It's been 3 months, Emily," he said. 3 months without a letter, without a sign. His voice trembled. Not even the leaders really know where he is. We then decided to write to church headquarters in Salt Lake City. We drafted a formal letter explaining everything, the latest communications, the disappearance, the evasive responses. 2 weeks later, we received a letter with the official seal. "Dear Sister Carter, we appreciate your concern. Have faith that the Lord is watching over your son. Local authorities are aware of the situation. Pray and trust. No details, no explanation, nothing to alleviate the despair." I walked through the house like a shadow. His room remained untouched, the bed made, the hymnal on the table, the old letters stacked in a box. Sometimes I opened the drawers just to smell his clothes. There was something sacred about the space, as if part of his soul still lingered there. I ran my fingers over the Elder Carter plaque and felt a lump in my throat. "Where are you, my son?" Time began to stretch, as if the days would never end. Every knock on the door made me shiver. Every unknown call left me breathless. On a cold night, the phone finally rang. It was the mission president. His voice was calm, rehearsed. "Sister Carter, your son is fine, but we've had a logistical problem. He's been transferred to a hard-to-reach area and won't be able to write often for the time being." "For now?" I asked. "But is he really okay? Has he spoken to you?" On the other end of the line, a brief silence. "He is in good hands, sister. The Lord cares for His servants." Before I could say anything, he said goodbye and hung up. That call didn't bring me peace. It brought fear, because a mother knows when the truth is being hidden. I sensed that behind that calm voice was something they didn't want me to know. The following months were a desert. I fasted, prayed, and sought answers in every general conference, in every scripture. I began to doubt even myself. Am I losing faith? Is this doubt a temptation? But my son's absence wasn't a test of faith. It was a wound that bled daily. I remember one night in particular. It was raining heavily, and the sound of the drops hitting the window sounded like a lament. I knelt alone in the living room and said aloud, "Lord, if he is dead, let me feel it. If he is alive, show me." The wind blew hard, and the candle I had lit went out. The darkness was total. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to understand. The faith that had sustained me began to crumble. The silence of the church, the silence of God, the silence of the people, they all screamed the same thing. Something was wrong, and no one wanted to talk about it. Symbolic phrase. I prayed every night, asking God to tell me where my son was. The confirmation came cruelly, not out of compassion, but out of carelessness. A young returned missionary, a childhood friend of my son's, came to visit me one Saturday afternoon. He looked nervous, sweating, and had a restless look in his eyes. He sat in the living room, and after a few minutes of silence, blurted out something that has never left my mind. "Sister Carter, the mission president told everyone to stop talking about Elder Carter. He said anyone who did would be disobedient to the priesthood." I froze. "Why?" I asked. The young man lowered his head and replied, "I don't know. All I know is that he disappeared." In that instant, everything around me stopped. The walls, the clock, the sound of the wind. I stared at him breathlessly. "Disappeared? What do you mean, disappeared? How long ago?" He hesitated. "It was a few months ago, but the church requested confidentiality. They said the family was already being informed. The family, we, had never been told anything." Anger and despair swirled together. I immediately called the bishop. He answered with a tense voice, as if he had been expecting the call. "Sister Carter," he said coldly, "please trust the church's process. Everything is being handled by the appropriate ecclesiastical authorities." "But my son is missing!" I shouted. "You hid this from us!" There was a long pause, followed by a response that pierced me like a knife. The prophet teaches that there are situations in which it is best to remain silent, so as not to cause confusion among the saints. It was at that moment that I realized the institution that claimed to serve God was more afraid of scandal than of the truth. My son's disappearance was no longer a tragedy. It was a secret to be managed. We began investigating on our own. My husband, always calm and rational, wrote again to church headquarters, demanding an official response. 3 weeks later, we received a carefully worded, letter-headed letter. "Dear brothers and sisters, Carter, we deeply regret your concern. We are cooperating with local authorities. We ask that you maintain discretion to protect the integrity of the missionary work." Protect her from what? A mother's grief? We called the American consulate in Chile. The operator checked the records and said, "We don't have any formal reports of a missing missionary with that name." It was like being punched. "But the church said it was working with you," I argued. He responded, surprised. "Ma'am, as far as No, there's no official investigation. No complaint has been filed." From then on, everything fell apart. We discovered that the church had never notified local authorities about the disappearance. They were handling it internally. What did that mean? No one would say anything. The mission president refused to return my calls. The bishop began avoiding contact. The Relief Society women who had previously visited me weekly now crossed the street when they saw me. I went to the stake center, determined to speak to the president. He greeted me with a tight smile, his eyes hard. "Sister Carter, we understand your pain, but it's important to maintain trust in the Lord and His servants." I stood up and shouted, "The Lord didn't command us to hide disappearances." He lowered his voice, looked me in the eye, and said, "Watch your words. Questioning the priesthood is the first step toward apostasy." I left there trembling. For the first time in decades, I felt afraid of the very church that claimed to love me. They didn't want the truth. They wanted control. The nights became unbearable. I couldn't sleep. I replayed every detail of the letters, every word my son had said. I began making lists, maps, notes, trying to piece together the puzzle. I found an old letter where he mentioned the name of a companion, Elder Matthews. After much persistence, I managed to locate his parents, who lived in Idaho. When I called them, his mother began to cry before I could even explain the reason for the call. "They told us not to talk about it," she confessed, "but my son told me something happened. He said the mission president was different, that he made strange demands." My body froze. I asked for more details, but she hesitated. "I can't, sister. They promised that if we stayed quiet, everything would be resolved soon. They promised." That word echoed in my mind for days. They promised silence in exchange for peace. But what kind of peace is there when a child is missing? I decided I wouldn't stay silent. I sent emails, letters, messages. I joined forums for former church members. It was there that I began to discover a terrifying pattern. Other parents, other families, other very similar stories. Young people who disappeared on distant missions, and cases that were hushed up to protect the name of the church. Shock mixed with indignation. How could an institution that preached the truth hide so much pain? The more I investigated, the more doors closed. Leaders said I was being influenced by the enemy, that my pain was being used by Satan to destroy faith. One of them called me dangerous. But dangerous for whom? For God or for them? I walked the streets with a mixture of grief and anger. Fellow ward members began to whisper. They said I was unstable, that I should accept the Lord's will. But the Lord I knew didn't silence the truth. He said, "The truth will set you free." It was then that I realized I was alone. I, a mother trying to find her own son, facing an entire institution determined to hide what had happened. In one of my last attempts at dialogue, the stake president came to my home. I sat across from him with my son's letters spread out on the table. "Just tell me the truth," I pleaded. "I'm not going to expose anyone. I just want to know what happened to my boy." He took a deep breath and replied, almost rehearsed, "There are things only the Lord can reveal. Sometimes silence is the hardest test of faith." It was at that moment that I understood. There was no plan to reveal anything. The silence was not faith. It was fear. While I was looking for my son, they were looking to protect the name of the church. Symbolic phrase. While I was looking for my son, they were looking to protect the name of the church. The day the truth began to emerge had no trumpets or divine signs. It came in the form of a small, unmarked package left on my porch one rainy morning. Inside was a battered notebook covered in a brown leather cover. When I opened it, I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was my son's journal, the same one he always carried on church trips, where he recorded his spiritual experiences. But the last pages were different. They no longer spoke of blessings, baptisms, or miracles. They spoke of fear. The opening lines read, "If anything happens to me, I want you to know I tried to do what was right." My body froze. I continued reading, my hands trembling. He wrote about strange meetings with the mission president, late-night gatherings with a group of leaders where they talked about sacrifice, testing loyalty, and purification. He said some missionaries had been punished for questioning orders. "I don't know what you're doing, Mom," he wrote, "but I feel like the Spirit isn't here anymore. Something is wrong." In the following pages, he mentioned that he had sent a confidential letter to church headquarters denouncing abusive behavior by the mission president and 2 assistants. They claim to represent God, but they manipulate in his name. I can no longer remain silent. The final notes seemed hurried, almost desperate. They said I was being influenced by Satan, that I needed to be isolated to regain my faith. I don't know what will happen to me, but I feel someone is watching me. I closed the diary and cried like never before. Everything made sense now. The silence, the cold letters, the disappearance. My son hadn't run away, nor gotten lost. He had been silenced. I ran to the bishop with the diary in hand. He read a few pages and turned pale. "Sister Carter, where did you get this?" he asked. "On my porch," I replied. He took a deep breath, closed the notebook, and said, "This shouldn't leave here. These things shouldn't be discussed outside the proper channels." "But this is proof," I shouted. "My son reported crimes." He simply replied, in a low, cutting tone, "The church doesn't move by rumors, sister. The enemy likes to use pain to destroy faith." I tried to show the journal to the stake president, but he refused. He said the words might be the fabrications of a troubled young man. "Your son was in a very intense spiritual environment," he said. "Sometimes young people get confused, but I knew my son. He was balanced, sensible, and had genuine faith. That diary wasn't the product of delusions. It was a testimony, a farewell." A few days later, I received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was male, hoarse, and hurried. "Sister Carter, don't say my name. I serve the same mission as your son." My heart raced. "Please tell me what happened," I pleaded. He hesitated. He discovered things he shouldn't have. The president and other leaders were holding secret meetings. They talked about spiritual power, but also about money, women, and punishments. Elder Carter tried to report it. They said he needed a spiritual reevaluation. After that, we never saw him again. The call ended before I could ask more. I stood, paralyzed, phone in hand, feeling the ground disappear beneath my feet. For the first time, pain gave way to anger. I had blindly trusted those men. I had placed my son in their hands, believing they were guided by God. And now I realized that that faith, which I had thought unshakable, had blinded me. I went to the local police station to file a formal complaint. The investigator, a weary-looking man, listened in silence. When I mentioned the name of the church and the mission president, he sighed and said, "You're not the first mother to come here, but every time we try to investigate, things disappear. Documents, records, testimonies, they have a lot of influence." I returned home with a heavy body, but a burning soul. From that moment on, I decided I would no longer be a silent voice. I spent days copying each page of the diary, hiding them in different places, afraid someone would come after me. And it wasn't paranoia. I began noticing cars parked for long periods in front of my house. Certain calls ended in silence with breathing on the other end. My husband, who had always maintained his faith, began to break down as well. "They knew, Emily," he said one night, staring into space. "They knew, and they hid it. Everything we did, every tithe, every hour of service, and now I realize our obedience fed them." He stood, picked up the Book of Mormon, and placed it on the table. "I still believe in God. but not in them. His words echoed in my chest. That was it. God hadn't failed us. It was the men who claimed to represent him who had failed. I tried to share the journal in a Mormon mothers group. I was kicked out within an hour. Defaming leaders is a grave sin. An administrator wrote, "We ask that you not spread lies again." The following Sunday, the bishop took me aside and said that if I continued spreading rumors, I could face church discipline. Apostasy begins this way, Sister Carter, with pain transformed into rebellion. But that wasn't rebellion. It was a search for truth. I returned to the diary every night, as if my son's words were the only thread connecting me to him. On one of the last pages, he wrote, "If my voice is silenced, let someone tell what happened. Light always conquers darkness." I closed the diary, took a deep breath, and understood that my son had left not just a warning, but a mission. The truth he'd tried to reveal was now my mission as well. Symbolic phrase. The faith that taught me to trust turned into the pain of having trusted too much. The following weeks were a hell shrouded in fake smiles and memorized answers. I still attended Sunday services, but I no longer felt like I belonged. People greeted me with empty phrases. "We're praying for you. The Lord knows what he's doing," and quickly walked away, as if my grief were contagious. The silence surrounding my son's disappearance had become a wall, and behind it stood the church I'd loved all my life. My husband and I requested an official meeting with the bishop and stake president. We sat in a cold room, illuminated by a harsh white light. I carried my son's journal in my hands, its pages already creased from leafing through it so much. "We just want answers," I began, trying to remain calm. "We want to know what really happened to our son." The bishop looked away and replied patronizingly, "Sister Carter, we understand your pain, but sometimes the Lord allows certain things to remain hidden for a time." My husband exploded. "Hidden? A young man disappears and you talk about hiding? That's cowardice." The stake president raised his hand, as if concluding a prayer, and said firmly, "Watch your words. The prophet is inspired. Questioning leadership is like doubting God himself." Those words hit me like stones. It was as if our family's suffering didn't matter compared to the image of the institution. I looked at them and asked, almost whispering, "What if it were your son? Would you also tell them to pray and wait?" Neither of them responded. They remained silent, staring at the ground, as if faced with a sin they couldn't confess. We left the chapel feeling like something had died inside us. What had once been faith now felt like a glass prison, transparent but unbreakable. We still saw God within, but we couldn't reach him. In the following days, the subtle forms of intimidation began. We received calls from concerned brothers saying that our pain was shaking the testimonies of other members. A Relief Society woman came to my house and said, with a tight smile, "The enemy preys on grieving mothers. Don't let your pain turn into rebellion." I wanted to scream. How could anyone call a mother's love rebellion? The stake president sent me a letter asking me to distance myself from apostate ex-member networks, claiming they were spreading lies about the restored gospel. I tore up the letter without reading it through. I had heard enough. These men didn't want to protect my faith. They wanted to protect their own power. But the real breakdown came one night during the sacrament. The choir sang softly, and I stared at the table where the bread and water were blessed. For so many years, that ritual had brought me peace. But now, all I could see was my son's absence. The chair where he usually sat was empty. The hymn said, "Trust in the Lord and lean not on your own understanding." I closed my eyes and thought, but what happens when the Lord is silent? A lump formed in my throat, and I hurried out of the chapel. Outside, the cold night wind buffeted my face, and for the first time in decades, I cried out to the heavens, "Where were you, God? Where were you when they silenced my son, when they hid him, when they lied in his name?" My tears fell, mixing with the rain. It was as if the heavens themselves were weeping with me. In the following days, I began to lose my appetite, my sleep, and my will to live. My husband tried to comfort me, but he too was broken. "I spent 30 years believing in them," he said, "and now I realize we've confused men with God." One day, we decided to try again. We went to church headquarters in Salt Lake City. We waited for hours until an advisor from the missionary department greeted us, a man in an impeccable suit and a calm voice. We explained everything, the disappearance, the diary, the evasive answers. He listened silently, without showing any emotion. When we finished, he simply said, "The church does not comment on internal matters. I advise you to continue praying and trusting in the prophet." That was the last straw. I looked at him and asked, "Trust someone who protects lies? Someone who turns mothers into enemies of the faith?" He smiled slightly, like someone trying to restrain a rebellious child. "Sister, it's natural to feel angry, but remember, obedience brings peace." That phrase haunted me for days. Obedience brings peace. But what kind of peace is this, built on suffering and silence? I began to realize that their faith ended where truth began. Anything that deviated from the perfect narrative was called temptation. Every sincere question was seen as rebellion, and every human pain was transformed into a spiritual test. Guilt began to eat away at me. I wondered if I could have done more, if I should have stopped my son from going. His face came to my mind every night, the smile, the sparkle in his eyes, the unwavering faith, and then emptiness. There was a moment when I considered abandoning everything, even my belief in God. But deep within my despair, something still told me that he was not to blame, that the lie was the work of men, not of heaven. One silent night, I knelt for the last time on my bedroom floor and said, "Lord, if you're still there, help me carry on. I don't want any more answers from them. I just want your truth." And it was in that moment, amidst the silence, that I felt a strange peace, not the peace the church promised, but a gentle calm, as if God had finally parted from the walls men had built in his name. From that moment on, I decided I would no longer beg for explanations. I would seek the truth with my own hands, even if it meant walking alone. Symbolic phrase. I realized that their faith ended where truth began. It was in an online forum created by former church members that I found my first ray of hope. I had spent months feeling alone, as if my pain were a lapse of faith, a divine punishment. But that night, as I read the testimonies of other mothers, I realized I wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, some with missing children, others with young people killed in unexplained circumstances while on missions in distant countries, all with the same scar, silence. A Utah woman named Rebecca wrote, "My son was serving a mission in Argentina. They said he had an accident, but the body never arrived. The church asked us not to question it, to preserve the testimony of other young people." Another woman from Nevada said her son returned in a state of shock, unable to speak, and that leaders committed him to a church-affiliated clinic. He said he saw things, rituals, punishments, abuse, but no one would listen. Each testimony was like a mirror of my own suffering. I began talking to these women over video calls. Our voices trembled, our stories intertwined. We weren't apostates. We were mothers trying to survive the weight of having trusted too much. We soon formed a group. We called it Silenced Voices, a simple name, but one that encapsulated everything we were. We created a collective email address, an anonymous website, and began compiling documents, letters, diaries, and records of disappearances. We discovered that many cases had never been officially registered. The church had handled everything internally. One of the mothers, Linda, obtained copies of confidential missionary reports from 1997, showing that young people had been repeatedly transferred without a record of their destination. Another father found letters exchanged between leaders requesting utmost discretion regarding field occurrences. This was more than coincidence. It was a carefully constructed system of concealment. We met weekly via video call, always at different times, for fear of being tracked. Some used pseudonyms, others spoke from secret places, with the lights off. We didn't want revenge, we just wanted the truth. Over time, an independent journalist from Provo became interested in the stories. His name was Daniel, also an ex-Mormon. He promised to investigate and publish a story. We spent months sending him evidence, diaries, and records. He listened to us patiently and respectfully. He said it would be the most difficult and dangerous story of his career. But even before publication, the reprisals began. I received a formal warning from local leadership. The church regrets your association with apostate groups. If you continue, you may face disciplinary action. Another mother received anonymous phone calls, with cold voices saying, "Let bygones be bygones, sister." Linda's car was broken into, and her laptop containing her files disappeared. The pain and fear returned, but now we were no longer alone. We sent copies of everything to different locations, encrypted files, hidden flash drives, backups abroad. If something happened to one of us, the others would carry on. In one of the online meetings, I remember Rebecca saying, "We may never find all our children, but we can prevent other mothers from going through the same thing." And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Despair was beginning to give way to purpose. Faith, once in ruins, began to be reborn. No longer faith in prophets in suits and ties, but in something greater and purer. Faith in love, truth, and courage. I began to realize that God had never abandoned me. He simply wasn't in that temple of silence and gold. He was in the voices that dared to speak. Journalist Daniel finally published the report, titled, "Lost Missionaries, the Secret the Church Doesn't Want to Reveal." The article went viral. Within a week, hundreds of people wrote to the website with similar stories. The press began pressing for official responses. For the first time, the church's silence was broken. Of course, they tried to deny everything. They called us liars, influenced by outside forces. But the damage was already done. The world was listening. I gave an anonymous interview. My voice trembled, but when the reporter asked why I had decided to speak, I replied, "Because silence never saved anyone, and because my son believed that light always conquers darkness." That night, after the publication, the group gathered virtually to pray. Not a formal prayer, with rehearsed phrases and names in sequence, but a simple, sincere prayer, shared among mothers who had learned the true meaning of faith. One of them said something I've never forgotten. "When pain is shared, it loses its power to destroy us." For the first time in a long time, I cried with relief. I understood that divine justice does not occur in human courts, but in the awakening of consciences. We keep fighting. Today, the group Silenced Voices helps families around the world, mothers from Mexico, Chile, the Philippines, and Canada. Each story is an open wound, but also a spark of hope. The system that tried to silence us ended up uniting us, and while the pain never completely disappears, we've learned that speaking out is a form of healing. Symbolic phrase, "When pain is shared, it loses its power to destroy us." The years passed, and with them came silence, a silence different from that imposed by the church, not the silence of fear, but the silence of a weary soul. I had spent everything I had searching for my son. I knocked on doors that never opened, wrote letters that were never answered. Sometimes I dreamed of him. I saw his serene face, the same smile he had when he left on his mission. I woke up crying, with the feeling he was trying to tell me something. Then one day, I got a call. It was from a hospital in another state. "Are you the mother of a man named Elder Carter?" My heart sank. Elder was his missionary title. Yes, that's me," I replied, my voice breaking. The dispatcher hesitated and then said, "Your son is alive, but he hasn't spoken in months." I was instantly taken aback. When I saw him lying on the bed, thin, staring blankly at the ceiling, I felt a mixture of joy and despair. He was breathing, but he wasn't the same anymore. His hands were shaking, his eyes afraid of the light. I sat beside him, held his cold fingers, and said, "Son, it's me. It's okay. I'm here." He slowly turned his face, and tears began to flow. No words, no sound, just that suppressed cry, the scream of a broken soul. Doctors said he had been found in a shelter, disoriented, repeating incoherent phrases about the mission and the punishment. No documents, no medical history. It was as if someone had erased his life from the records. For the next few months, I cared for him at home. Every small gesture was a victory. One day he managed to say, "Mom," and that was enough. I hugged him, as if the whole world depended on that moment. But little by little, I realized I would never have all the answers. He would fall silent when he tried to remember what happened. He would cry when he heard church hymns. She would tremble at the sight of men in suits. The trauma was deeper than any words could explain. And it was there, sitting beside my wounded son, that I understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, nor about absolving. It's about letting go of what binds you to the past. It's about freeing yourself from the poison of hate. I haven't forgiven the church. I haven't forgiven the men who hid the truth. But I have forgiven myself for blindly believing, for letting fear speak louder than conscience. One night, as the wind blew through the window, I looked up at the sky and said, God, I don't want any more answers. I just want peace. And I felt something different, a lightness, as if I could finally breathe after years of being submerged. I began to understand that God never asked me to protect an institution. He asked me to protect my heart. He wasn't in the gilded pulpits, nor in the speeches about obedience. He was in my son's tears, in the courage of the mothers I met, and in the strength that still got me up each morning. I began visiting other families who had experienced the same thing. Some lost their children forever. Others, like me, found them again, but with deep scars. In each look, there was pain and love mingled, but also a glow, that of rebuilt faith, the kind born of truth. One day, one of these mothers told me something I have never forgotten. We may never know everything that happened, but we know what can no longer happen. Silence. These words have become my daily prayer. Silence is no longer my enemy. It is my reminder that there are things only the heart can understand. I learned that the faith born of pain is the only one that survives silence, because it's a faith that doesn't depend on promises, but on presence. A faith that doesn't fear questioning, because it knows that God's truth doesn't need walls or secrets to remain standing. Today, my son lives with me. He still has difficult days, nightmares that make him wake up screaming, but he also has moments of light. He's started painting. His canvases are full of soft colors, long horizons, and small human figures against the sky, as if he's searching for God within art. Sometimes he hands me a painting and simply says, "It's about freedom." I understand. Freedom is the miracle that remains. Sometimes people still ask me if I still believe. I smile and reply, I do, but in a different way, because now my faith doesn't belong to a plaque, a prophet, or an organization. It belongs to the truth and to the reminder that no temple is more sacred than the human heart. Today, when I close my eyes to pray, I no longer ask for answers. I ask only for discernment. I ask for the strength to forgive what I cannot change and the courage to change what can still be healed. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain, but it gave me back the right to live without hate. It didn't rebuild the faith I lost. It built a new one, quieter but much truer. Symbolic phrase. The faith that is born of pain is the only one that survives. Silence. Today, looking back, I realize that my story isn't just about pain. It's about awakening. I spent years believing that obedience was the purest form of faith, that questioning was doubting God, that suffering in silence was an act of devotion. But now I understand. Silence isn't sacred when it protects lies. The real sin was never doubting. It was accepting evil disguised as holiness. I speak for my son, and for all the sons and daughters who have disappeared in the name of blind faith. I speak for every mother who was told to shut up, for every father who was threatened, for every missionary who was forgotten somewhere in the world. I speak for those who are still afraid to speak out, and for those who no longer can. Because when a religion demands silence in the face of injustice, it ceases to be a path to God and becomes a prison for the soul. Today I know that God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for an awakened conscience. He doesn't dwell in gilded temples, nor does he speak only through prophets in suits. He speaks through conscience, through compassion, through the inner voice that tells us what is right even when the whole world demands we remain silent. For a long time, I feared being called an apostate, a rebel, a heretic. But now I understand that these words are used to control the fears of others, not God's truth. Faith based on control is not faith. It is power disguised as spirituality. And power, when not illuminated by truth, always destroys what it touches. My son taught me something no scripture could ever teach, that love is stronger than doctrine, and that God's presence needs no intermediaries. When I saw him reborn, even with the wounds he carries to this day, I realized that faith is not blind obedience. It is an act of courage. Courage to see, courage to feel, courage to tell the truth, even when the price is rejection. If my voice reaches someone today who still lives trapped by fear, I want them to know they are not alone. There is life after the temple. There is light after the darkness. And there is a God who is not offended when you ask. He is saddened when you stop seeking. Many tell me I've lost faith. I smile, because it was exactly the opposite. I found it, not in the hands of men, but in the eyes of a wounded son who still believes in love. Faith isn't closing your eyes. It's opening them. Even if the sight hurts, it's seeing the truth and still choosing love. Today I speak without anger, without rancor. I speak with peace, because I understood that God doesn't need defenders. He needs witnesses to the truth, and I chose to be one of them. Faith is not about obeying the loudest voice, but about listening to the gentle whisper from within, the one that says, "Arise, speak, set yourself free. My son may never be the same again, and I may never know everything that happened, but that no longer holds me captive, because I've discovered that true faith doesn't seek to understand the past. It builds the future with honesty." Today, when I close my eyes, I no longer see the stern faces of the leaders who told me to be quiet. I see my son's smile, the sparkle in the eyes of the mothers who fight, and I feel something pure, a love that requires no fear. And that's why I chose to speak, because every word is a candle lit in the darkness. Every testimony is a breath of courage for those who still live in silence. If this story has reached you, perhaps it's no coincidence. Perhaps it's God telling you, it's time to wake up, time to stop fearing and start seeing. Comment, "I'm awake. I want to know the truth." Leave your like if this story touched you. Subscribe for more real stories. And see the next video. Another testimony from someone who also dared to tell the truth. Because in the end, the message is simple, eternal, and liberating. God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for an awakened conscience.